Among the largest turboprop aircraft ever built, the short Belfast was a strategic transport plane built for the RAF Transport Command during the height of the Cold War. But despite the aircraft illustrating cargo capacity that rivaled the far more successful C-130 Hercules, only 10 of these massive machines were ever assembled, and within a decade of their introduction, they were retired from their military roles to the quiet life of civilian work, museum pieces, or the scrapyard. The story of the Belfast begins in 1957, when during a period of rising tensions between the capitalist forces of NATO and the communist forces of the USSR, the RAF identified the need for a new strategic troop transport aircraft which could replace earlier models such as the aging Handley Page Hastings and the sluggish Blackburn Beverley. This corresponding with a study undertaken by the Short Brothers Aircraft Company of Belfast, which was investigating the possibility of matching an arrangement of 4 Bristol Orion turboprop engines with an airframe that had been optimized for the purpose of transporting various military stores. Although the rise in nuclear arsenals rendered conventional warfare between the superpowers somewhat obsolete, the forces of NATO still required the use of traditional transport aircraft for intervening in other conflicts unrelated to the wider Cold War, examples being the emerging troubles of Southeast Asia that would eventually spiral into the Vietnam War, and the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s, during which rebel forces in Kenya rose up against the colonial rule of Britain. Upon hearing that the RAF was in need of a transport aircraft, and would therefore likely issue an operational requirement for such a model in the near future, Short continued their studies into an appropriate design to suit the RAF's needs, although Sir Matthew Slattery, chairman of the Short Company, was doubtful as to the practicality of constructing such an aircraft, believing that a far more cost-effective method to developing a new transport aircraft would be to source components and systems from the pre-existing Bristol Britannia, of which the RAF Transport Command had several in operation with No. 99 and No. 511 squadrons, the outcomes of this mindset being to reduce development time and expense while improving reliability at the cost of performance. The proposed short model was submitted in March 1957 as the PD-18 Britannic, and essentially took the Bristol Britannia's airframe and modified it to include a larger fuselage and the fitting of high-mounted wings, these, together with the tail unit, engines, landing gear and various other systems, being carried over from the Britannia, while the cross-section of the modified fuselage was increased to accommodate a 12-foot square load for the carriage of bulky items such as radar units and the Blue Streak medium-range ballistic missile, as well as acting as a troop transport. Short's proposal was well timed, as by the middle of the year, the RAF had issued Operational Requirement ASR 371, which required the development of a heavy strategic freighter which was capable of carrying a wide range of military payloads over long ranges, including artillery, more than 200 troops, helicopters, tanks, and guided missiles, the minimum design parameters for the concept being to be able to carry 30,000 pounds of materials over a 3,600 nautical mile range. Therefore, having predicted this move, Short reworked their Britannic concept into a stretched model called the Britannic 3A, while continued evolution of the design eschewed many of the original Britannia-based underpinnings in favour of scratch-built components, sections and systems, including a revised wing and the adoption of Rolls-Royce Tyne turboprop engines from the upcoming Canadair CC-106 Yukon, the name of the model being revised in February 1959 from the short PD-18 Britannic to the Belfast C-1, of which an order for 10 was placed by the RAF on December 21, 1960. Each of which would be named after ancient figures of strength in Greek, Biblical and Roman lore: Samson, Goliath, Pallas, Hector, Atlas, Hercules, Theseus, Spartacus, Ajax, and Enceladus. The Belfast incorporated a high-mounted wing upon which were placed 4 Rolls-Royce Tyne turboprop engines, while the cargo deck of the aircraft was 84 feet long and 16 feet wide, and could be accessed through a beaver tail, with rear loading doors and an integral ramp, the capacity of the Belfast being 150 troops with full equipment, a single Chieftain tank, 3 Alvis Saladin armoured cars, a pair of Westland Wessex helicopters, 4 Westland Whirlwind helicopters, 6 Westland Wasp or Westland Scout helicopters, or a pair of Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missiles. With a maximum takeoff weight of over 220,500 pounds, supported by a 2-wheel nose gear and 8-wheel main bogie, the Belfast was smaller than the 250-ton Antonov AN-22 and the 128-ton Douglas C-133 Cargo Master, but was larger than the Lockheed C-130 Hercules, the flying controls of the Belfast incorporating numerous features developed through a joint venture by Short, Bristol and Canadair, and utilized the same manual servo tab system as was found on the Britannia, but included major advancements in the lateral control via a simpler spoiler configuration, as well as including the linkage of the port aileron to the rudder to counteract adverse rolling due to rudder deflection. The Belfast also had the distinction of being the first aircraft, as built, to include a fully automatic landing system developed by Smiths Aerospace, while the autopilot and flight control system, known as the ASR 518, was triplex in the roll-in pitch channels, with duplex or emergency simplex ability. The instrument landing system comprising many functions such as an auto throttle, a heads-up display, and radio altimeter. On January 5, 1964, the prototype Belfast conducted its maiden flight from Sydenham Airport in its namesake city, before being sent in October of the same year to undertake 2 weeks of performance trials near Madrid in Spain and later Nairobi in Kenya. Confidence for these aircraft by the Short Company being so great that the firm readied its production facilities for further Belfast assembly, estimating that 30 units would be required in order to break even on the project. To help reach this goal, Short envisaged a possible range of civilian derivatives of the airframe, which could occupy both a freight and passenger role. The SC-510A proposed to be a direct civilian translation of the RAF's Belfast C-1, with an MTOW of £85,000, while also being designed in a combi manner, which allowed for either exclusive freight carriage, a single deck of 150 passenger seats above the freight compartment, or a double-deck passenger configuration, which could carry up to 288 passengers. This was followed by the SC-531 model, which modified the Belfast design to include a swinging cargo nose for easier loading and an increased cargo capacity, while again mooting the possibility of the airliner occupying a combi role for transatlantic services between London and New York, either as a fully cargo aircraft with a payload limit of £100,000, a half-passenger, half-freight configuration with 138 passenger seats and £55,000 of cargo space, or a 288-seat fully passenger airliner. This proposal coming alongside talks with British domestic carrier, BEA, as to the possibility of creating a short-haul double-deck airliner, again with 288 seats, which would replace the Vickers Vanguard on trunk European routes to Paris and Berlin. On top of potential civilian variants, further military options were also developed, including the SC-535 for ultra-long-range strategic freight operations, the SC-515 tactical transport configuration, and the SC-521 advanced tactical airlifter, which would be modified to allow for STOL or short takeoff and landing capabilities under RAF operational requirement OR-351, while in 1964, Short outlined a possible partnership with American aerospace firm Lockheed to develop the SC-540, a combination of the Belfast's fuselage with the wings and 4 Pratt & Whitney JT3D turbojet engines of the Lockheed C-141 Starlifter, this model being created not only to satisfy operational requirement ASR-364, but also because it could potentially have been promoted for civilian use with BOAC as a jet-powered combi transport, but as with the other derivative models for the Belfast, it never went beyond the drawing board. Unfortunately, during tests, problems of excess airframe drag, which reduced payload range performance by 11%, were encountered due to the shape of the rear fuselage, ramp and rear loading doors, meaning that, as a strategic transport, the aircraft severely underperformed in terms of range and speed, requiring the production models to be retrofitted with extensive modifications to rectify these faults. On January 10, 1966, the first Belfast was delivered to Transport Command 5-3 Squadron at RAF Brize Norton in Oxfordshire, and the aircraft quickly proved their worth during 1967, when, following the withdrawal of British forces from the Crown Colony of North Borneo, Belfast were used to airlift 11 Westland Whirlwind helicopters of 230 Squadron back to the UK, while in 1970, the aircraft were heavily involved in withdrawing British forces during the Libyan coup, which led to the rise of Colonel Gaddafi as military dictator of the nation, the Belfasts regularly carrying loads of up to £78,000 to RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. However, with the changing policies towards military operations as the influence of the British Empire shrank, the option for an additional 20 units on top of the 10 already constructed was dropped in 1967, and with no other potential customers, the Short Belfast project was axed, while those units in RAF operation worked simply in a support role for non-tactical situations, including logistics flights to the USA, an 88-hour circumnavigation of the world, the transport of spares for McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom IIs from their St. Louis factory in America to the UK, and their involvement in the ultimately unsuccessful European Launcher Development Organization program, wherein equipment and parts for the Europa 1 and 2 rockets were transported from Britain to the Royal Australian Air Force Woomera Range Complex in South Australia for launch. The Belfast career with the RAF, though, would be a fleeting one, as with the UK's declining influence on the world stage during the 1970s, together with significant national deficits in the wake of the 1973 recession, a swathe of cuts were administered to all factions of the UK's armed forces, while under the RAF's Strike Command policy of 1968, a majority of the active squadrons were rationalised, and on September 14, 1976, 5-3 Squadron was disbanded and all its aircraft, including Belfast's, Britannia's and de Havilland Comet jets, were put up for sale, the Belfast having only racked up a mere 9,000 hours of flying time per unit with the RAF. Having been retired after only 9 years of use, the Belfasts were put into warm storage at RAF Kemble, while one example, X-Ray Romeo 366 Atlas, remained at RAF Bryce Norton and was kept serviceable for demonstration flights to potential civilian buyers, 7 of the units being sold to Rolls-Royce in 1977 for engine testing at their flight test establishment at Hucknall Aerodrome north of Nottingham, 3 of which were scrapped there in 1979 in order to salvage their Tyne power plants. In 1978, the last production Belfast, X-Ray Romeo 371 Enceladus, which had been sent to Hucknall for parts recovery, was flown to the newly established Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford Airfield in Shropshire, while the remaining 3 units were taken up by Liverpool-based cargo airline Transmeridian Air Cargo, but would only operate with the airline for 2 years, before it was merged with IAS Cargo Airlines to form British Cargo Airlines, later to be renamed TAC Heavylift. Under heavy-lift operation, the surviving airworthy Belfasts worked a variety of roles, and would even see service with the RAF once again during the Falklands War of 1982 and the Gulf War of 1991, wherein heavy lifts units were hired to undertake logistical transport flights between the UK and the combat zones. The aircraft's 12-foot cross-section and 86-foot cargo area making it a cheap and attractive choice for many clients throughout the 1980s and 1990s, with tasks carried out including the shipment of Westland Sea King helicopters to the Indian Navy and Bristow helicopters to Lagos in Nigeria to support heavy lift zone operations, arguably the largest loads carried by the aircraft being fuselage sections for BAC-111 jet airliners. By the 1990s, though, the non-standard nature of the 3 surviving airworthy Belfasts was starting to become evident as spares became harder to source, and following the withdrawal of Golf Bravo Foxtrot Yankee uniform Hercules in 1992 and Golf Bravo Echo Papa Sierra Theseus in 2001, both of which were stripped for parts and scrapped at Southend Airport in Essex, the final active Belfast, Golf Hotel Lima Foxtrot Tango Hector, was flown to Brisbane in Queensland in 2003 so as to work various ad hoc freight flights across Southeast Asia, including the carriage of relief supplies to the Solomon Islands in 2008. In 2011, though, the Belfast was grounded and put into storage at Cairns Airport in Queensland due to an ongoing legal dispute between the aircraft's owners and the airport management over unpaid landing fees, and while the aircraft hasn't flown for over a decade, rumours have circulated for years as to its possible reactivation, the aircraft having undergone engine tests during 2018, although no solid proposals have been outlined regarding the aircraft's future. Overall, the short Belfast, while a capable transport aircraft, was an unfortunate victim of circumstance, as although it could match the likes of the C-130 Hercules for flying capacity, its comparatively low cruising speed, combined with it being delivered during a period when the influence of Britain on global politics was facing severe decline, meant it was a model far too late to see a major role in tactical situations, although its many talents as a cargo plane did allow it a long and fruitful life in the service of civilian users, where it proved itself as a sturdy and robust asset when transporting some of the toughest loads.